you to take your seats soon. And I understand that there's sometimes a little bit of difficulty hearing. So if you see a seat further to the front, please come down. It'll be much easier to hear. And we will have a little time for questions after a couple of the talks in this second session. So if you have a question, please think about asking it. And I'm going to ask if they could leave the lights a little bit higher so I can even see your hand. And it's going to happen. Great. Thank you very much. Yes. Because it was rather dark before, and that doesn't help us to ask questions, to feel like we're part of the participating members of the symposium. But you really are part of the symposium. So I'd like to welcome you back now. You think we should start? Yes. Yes. Welcome back, and it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Eric Hanushek. Rick is the Paul and Jean Hanna Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University. Professor Hanushek is a leader in the development of economic analysis of educational issues. His work frequently enters into the design of national and international educational policy. His research spans such diverse areas as the impact of teacher quality, high-stakes accountability, equity and efficiency in school finance, and class size reduction, along with the role of cognitive skills in international growth and development. Professor Hanushek's pioneering analysis measuring teacher quality through growth in student achievement forms the basis for current research into the value-added assessment of teachers and schools. He's authored and edited 20 books along with over 200 articles. He's a distinguished graduate of the United States Air Force Academy and completed his PhD in economics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Hanushek, I invite you now to present your lecture on the relationship between mathematical skills and economic development.
Thank you very much. I think that I've been invited here as the token non-mathematician. But since all of you are here self-selected because you believe mathematics is important, I have taken the challenge to convince you that you have undervalued the role of mathematics and that it's more important than you actually think. So that's my topic for today. If you talk about economic development, the only thing that matters is economic growth, the rate of growth. And if you talk about economic growth, I am going to assert that the only thing that matters in terms of long-run growth is the skills of the population. I'm going to try to convince you of that. And in the process, talk about some of the ways that you can improve skills and improve growth. Now, I should mention that I live at Stanford in California. That's one suburb away from Mountain View, California. You may not know Mountain View, California unless you go to Google Earth. And the automatic place that Google Earth goes from way out in space around Saturn is to Mountain View, California, which is the next suburb and where Google is located. So my talk today will start at about 30,000 feet, not quite the full Google Earth, and then I'll try to get down a little bit closer to Earth as the talk goes on. So I'm going to start with some of the challenges and then talk a little bit about solutions. I'm not sure if I was asked to talk about solutions to this problem, but since many of you in this audience have a real influence on education policy in your countries, I would like to plant some ideas with you when you talk about education policies. Now let me start by a big overview, and that is that economists, particularly over the last 25 years, have been especially concerned with economic growth. It turns out that economic growth is much, much, much more important than worrying about the current business cycle. While the whole world has been concerned about the 2008 recession, it has led to ignoring the long run, and this is a huge mistake. Now, as economists have looked at economic growth, they invariably say that human capital is important. And by human capital, they often mean, as instituted by policies of governments in the world, how many years of schooling people have around the world. We know from the United Nations Millennium Development Goals or the World Bank's Education for All policy, which are essentially designed to make sure that everybody gets at least an 8th grade education. And they've pushed on that. I'm going to start out by saying that I think that those policies were a mistake. And it's a little bit hard to say that, right? Because how can you argue against getting everybody education? And the reason is the following. If I look at this picture, I think I can point. What I've plotted here is, I did the wrong thing. What I've plotted here is something called conditional years of schooling. I'll explain conditional in a minute. Think of years of schooling of a country against the growth rate. This is long-run growth rates. It's growth rates, average annual growth rate in GDP per capita over a period 1960 to 2000. And what do you see? All the points and labels here are individual countries of the world that we have data for. And what you see is that growth increases with years of schooling. But the real puzzle has been, first, the East Asian miracle. We have seen that East Asia has grown much more rapidly than you would have predicted by the relationship with school attainment. And secondly, what's important for this conference, we've seen the Latin American growth puzzle, that Latin America has lagged the rest of the world from what you would expect in terms of their schooling. The argument that I'm going to make is the same as why I don't like education for all. This is the wrong picture. The right picture that unifies growth around the entire world is to array test scores. Think of Pisa scores or TIMSS scores that you all know against growth rates. And what you see is that everybody's on this line and very close to this line. I forgot to explain what conditional meant. Conditional appears again here. What's behind this is a very simple statistical regression analysis where conditional means that it's taking into account the starting income level of a country. And that's obvious because if you start behind, it's really easy to grow fast because all you have to do is copy what everybody else does. If you start ahead, you have to invent new things. So it's harder to grow fast. So that's the only thing else behind this picture. But what you see now is that the East Asian countries are right on this line, and the Latin American countries in red are right on this line. And what unifies this whole story is the picture, if I look at years of schooling versus test scores, or what people know, you see that East Asia has learned more per year of schooling than almost everybody else in the world, and Latin America has learned less. The previous diagram took me a long time to understand, but the combination of this says that if you go to school and don't learn anything, it doesn't count. And that's the full story that I have here. Now, what I also want to do is to describe to you why you've underestimated the importance of, I'm going to call it mathematics, but it's a combination of mathematics and science and the skills, cognitive skills that you learn in school, why you've underestimated it. Because what you couldn't tell very easily from the previous line was how steep the relationship is between test scores and growth rates. In fact, I might go back to this if I can. I shouldn't try to do things that I don't know how to do. What this line says, if you look at Korea here, all of these are countries, if you look at Korea, if Korea had only been achieving at the average level for the OECD, for the developed countries of the world, history suggests that Korean growth would have been 2% per year less over this entire 40-year period. I don't think I have to explain too much what compound growth rates mean and compound interest means to mathematicians. 2% per year is a huge number. Compared to that, if we look down here at countries from Ecuador or the Philippines, had they been learning at the OECD average, they would have grown at 2% faster per year. Now these numbers add up. And let me, since you're going to Brazil in 4 years, put this all into the Brazilian context. First, here's a picture that is designed so that none of you can actually read this. Even those with the most acute eyesight in the front of the room can't read this. But what this is a listing of individual countries broken out by regions of the world and test scores. And so the first column is sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, and then the Middle East, North Africa region. And what is important about this is that there's almost no overlap between those regions of the world and Asia, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and this collection of what we call the Commonwealth countries, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States, the sort of old Brit colonies in the developed world. And there's no overlap. This is important, and this is what future development means of getting some overlap. Now let me give you the example of Brazil. I'm going to just take a very simple projection of the future and say that history for the last half century holds into the future. And I'm going to assume that the historical patterns of that line between test scores or cognitive skills and growth rates hold for the future. I'm going to assume that they hold over the next 80 years. And what I'm going to do is calculate the present value to GDP of countries based upon an improvement in test scores. So take the following example. Brazil mounts a campaign to improve its Pisa scores by 25 points over the next 20 years. Now that amounts to 1/4 of a standard deviation on Pisa tests or something like that. And I'll show you that that's feasible in a minute. And then project out what that would mean for economic growth in the future compared to what would happen if there was no improvement in performance. So what this amounts to is Brazil moves up to the level of Trinidad and Tobago or Mexico. So we're not talking about making Brazil into Finland. Here's the picture of math performance. This is Pisa 2009 in math. Brazil is down near the bottom, as I showed you before, with the Latin American countries. Relating, by the way, to the prior talk, If I'd shown you 2012, you would have seen that Vietnam is actually over in this area of the chart now in their first time taking the Pisa test. And all of these are arrays of countries that you can get out to the United Kingdom there, or the United States there in the middle, and the rest in the middle. But I'm saying, what would happen if Brazil moved up by 25 points? So moved ahead in this curve to roughly Mexico level. And I'm going to project that out. The present value over the next 80 years of that improvement is 279% of the current Brazilian GDP. Almost 3 times the current GDP. Now, put that into perspective. That means that over the next 80 years, the average GDP of Brazil would be 6% higher each and every year over the next 80 years, which is roughly equivalent to every worker in Brazil having a 12% higher per year paycheck over the next 80 years. I assert that most of you didn't think of math performance in that way. Now it's feasible because actually Brazil in the past 15 years has improved at roughly that rate as had Chile. Here's Brazil, this is increases in test scores over time, starting out with Argentina and Tunisia, getting up to Chile, Brazil, Latvia, and some others, Portugal and Hong Kong at the top. It's not all countries that are behind. So it is feasible to do that. But it's not feasible to do it the way most countries initially want to do it. And this is where I hope to enlist you when you talk about education policy in your own countries, to think about what it would mean to, in fact, improve, not on the test scores per se, but in the knowledge content that lies behind these test scores, to improve the schools to that knowledge. There's one, well, I'll get back done. So before I do that, the logical question that you all should have and probably do have is, well, can you really interpret this picture that relates test scores to growth rates as a causal relationship? If a country manages to improve its test scores, can we legitimately expect it to improve its growth rates? So there's been a lot of work and analysis around this that I and others have been involved in, but let me just show you one simple picture to try to explain this to you. The international tests that were behind that picture that I showed you actually have been going on since 1965, when a small number of countries participated in an international testing situation. And the United States and some other countries have participated in these tests rather continuously since 1965 till the present day. And what you do see is that there are some countries that have shown that they can improve. The one that makes all the headlines in the world is Finland, which has shown that over this time it has had dramatic improvements. Usually when I give this talk, nobody doubts that Italy has in fact fallen down. And then you see Japan and Korea are high with some improvement and so forth. Now, if my story is right, the steepness of these lines should directly translate into a change in growth rates over the period. Okay, because what I want to do is eliminate all the country-specific cultural differences. So what I'm going to do is take annual growth rates, those things that appear in your newspaper all the time, that the economy grew at 4% last year and so forth. And I'm going to just draw a straight line for each country through growth rates over the last 40 years. And if my story is right, we should see countries that have steep improvements in test scores should also have improvements in their growth rates. The growth rate itself should be improving. And so here's a simple picture that shows you that the trend in test scores, or the steepness of that line is here, the trend in growth rates from just drawing lines through growth rates for each country is here. And what you see is that at least all the countries fall in the correct quadrant. Countries that have improved their test scores have also managed to improve their growth rates over this time. And, you know, there's Italy down here, here's Finland up here. You see that countries that have in fact improved in test scores. So it's not conclusive evidence, but what I'm going to assert is that the stories are clear enough that you should take them as real. And so let me talk then a little bit about that. The conclusions here, and I'm going to turn into talking about what needs to be done in a second, is really powerful effects of cognitive skills with support here and beyond that this is a causal story. And a second part of this, that the developing countries of the world, many of whom are represented here, are farther behind than conventional stories suggest. Let me show you a picture of Brazil. I don't mean to pick on Brazil, even though that's, the Congress will go there next year. What this is a picture on the left-hand side of the attendance, enrollment in schools. So 4% of Brazilian kids, this is about 10 years old, never enrolled in school. 29% drop out by grade 5. Another 46% drop out before grade 9, and 22% make it to grade 9. But if I take a simple standard that somebody in grade 9 ought to be within 1 standard deviation of the OECD mean in mathematics performance, I find of that 22%, we get down to 8% that are fully literate, meaning that they are at least at the 16th percentile of the OECD distribution. I can run through other countries just so it's not picking on Brazil here. 12% of Peruvian kids are fully literate by that standard, even though 60% of Peruvian kids go through at least grade 9. The conventional standard of performing well. 5% in Ghana, 30% in Colombia, that they do better. So you can see by the darkness here of how many at least get to the 16th percentile of the OECD distribution. But the challenges are huge. Now, let me talk a little bit about policies. The first one that countries always go to is what I would call resource policies. If we have to fix the schools of the country, it's obvious that we just have to spend more. Okay? There's actually very little evidence that that works if you take a given country and just throw in more money into its schools. The cross-country evidence, within-country evidence of developed countries, and within-country evidence in developing countries all suggest real caution that resource policies per se are going to have much impact. Here's a picture that, a simple picture just to make the point, where I'm plotting the cumulative spending per student on the horizontal axis and Pisa scores. This is Pisa mathematics in 2003 on the vertical axis. I can do it any year of Pisa and get the same answer. What you see is that there's a slight positive line between resources and performance. That positive line is entirely explained by Greece and Mexico that do so horribly. And you should only look at the red line if you believe you're going to learn a lot from what Greece and Mexico are doing. Okay. Now, this is obvious, you can always object to this. This is a simple picture. But if I looked at the change in spending of countries over the last dozen years against the change in their Pisa scores, I would also see no relationship. So it's not just something about countries. If for individual countries, putting in more money per se doesn't consistently lead to improvements. Just to be clear, this doesn't say that resources never have an effect, nor does it say that resources cannot have an effect. To an economist, though, it says that you shouldn't have any expectation of an effect if you put it into the current systems with the current incentives that exist for performance in the schools. So let me turn to the obvious answer at one level, and that is what really counts is teacher quality. There is now substantial evidence to suggest that teachers are essentially all that counts. There's a little bit around the edge about having good textbooks and maybe curriculum and so forth, but the quality of the teachers is what counts. But there again is discouraging stories for just pursuing what we've always done in the past. I should say much of this evidence comes from the US, but there is growing evidence in both developing and developed countries that it's the same. And that is, there's a long list of standard items that we usually use to identify teacher quality. They include how much education does the teacher have, how much experience do they have, whether they're fully certified to teach in the schools, what the character of their preparation was, whether they're getting professional development. None of these, with the slight asterisk here beside experience, have anything to do systematically with teacher quality. The asterisk means that in the first couple of years of teaching, most teachers on average get better. But after the first couple of years, experience means nothing. That a fifth-year teacher on average is as good as a 25th-year teacher. So what this means is that first, there's a lot of growing evidence that you can observe who are good teachers as opposed to trying to guess on the basis of their characteristics. But it also means that it's really hard to sit in the national capital and regulate good quality teaching. That just doesn't happen very well. So let me give you an example. This is actually a slide that I added because it's the first time I've ever talked to mathematicians, and of course you believe that preparation in math is good for teaching. And so I'm going to support that notion, that having teachers that know math actually is positive for teaching. This is a study that I did in rural northeast Brazil quite a while ago. Rural northeast Brazil is one of the poorest areas of the world. At the time that I did this study a while back, the average parental education level was 2 years. And the World Bank had a study there where they tried various policies to improve education. They tested students regularly and looked at the growth in student achievement, and they had to devise special tests for the area because the tests that would normally be given to second and fourth graders in Sao Paulo were much too difficult for the students in the Northeast. So they devised these special tests, and then if you look at it and you compare, the other thing was in a unique part of this study, they managed to give the fourth grade math test to the teachers themselves. What you found was that teachers that did better on the fourth grade math test, in fact, helped their students to learn more. It was more important to know math, but you also found that there were a whole bunch of other things that were important too, that was not the only answer. The most interesting part of this, I think, which is part of the challenge that many of you face in your own countries, is that you can compare the scores of the 4th grade students in math and Portuguese to the scores of their teachers. And there's the good and bad part of this. The good part is that on average, teachers outperform their students on the 4th grade math and Portuguese test. The bad news is that you can see that they're quite a ways away from 100% on these watered down 4th grade tests. And so if you have teachers that don't really know what they're doing, you wonder whether they can impart the right knowledge. Let me just go quickly on, and there might be a moment or two for questions too. The key element is to focus on outcomes, the performance of students. Most of our policy is instead based upon spending or attendance or whether students have iPads and things like this, technology. And it turns out that most of these measures of inputs to education aren't closely related to what students learn at the other end. It's also clear that in a number of countries, because of the Education for All initiative and so forth, there's been an emphasis on trying to get more kids in school attending. And these are cash transfer programs where students or their families get money if their student actually attends schools. And what those studies that started in Mexico, they've been replicated in Brazil and a number of African countries now, what they systematically find is that the incentives to attend schools get kids to attend more school. At the same time, the kids don't learn anything. Achievement doesn't go up when you induce them to go to school. So that these, again, input policies that we've relied on so much don't really work. There's no substitute for measuring the performance that you care about. There's substantial evidence on teacher effectiveness that relates to this, that you can't regulate it, but there are a number of places, including Washington, D.C. now, that have very innovative programs that reward teachers based upon how much their students learn. And it looks like those are having positive impacts on performance. It's basically hard to change teacher quality directly by sitting there and declaring what you want. So The Economist looks for incentives to get people working in the right direction. One of them is having a strong accountability system where you actually measure student performance and achievement and hold people responsible in one way or another for whether kids are learning in the schools as opposed to whether they're there. There's evidence internationally, looking across countries and within countries, that allowing more parental choice on where kids go to school has a positive impact on performance. This particularly works in urban settings, but there are now a variety of rural options and private options that are growing rapidly in some parts of the world. Rewarding performance, paying people who do well and not paying people who do badly turns out to be an important incentive. And there's a little bit of question in the research about whether allowing individual schools to make their own decisions works or not. Essentially, the evidence suggests that it works in developed countries, but it's less certain in developing countries, because, particularly if you don't have good monitoring of outcomes. But that's an open question. The other thing that I would mention quickly is that there's often an approach to look at technology and innovations. A number of Latin American countries are on the iPad for All program. There are differing views of what these programs are about, whether they complement what the teachers are doing, whether they substitute for teachers or replace teachers altogether. The part that is not well understood and that's important and has led to confusion about whether these things are good or bad is that we haven't thought a lot about the incentives to get teachers involved in using technology and getting the right technology and putting it in place. And this lack of thinking through the incentives, I think, has led to a lot of expensive toys being passed out among schools without affecting learning very much. It's also probably important to think about individual local circumstances and what can and cannot work. Finally, the point that I would make is that there are wide differences in what works in what circumstances, and that there is no substitute for evaluating policies and deciding which ones that you've put into place are working and which ones should be discarded. That's a little bit against the grain of most educational policy, because most educational policy wants to add a new program on top of what we were doing before, and you just keep adding new programs without consideration of which of them are most effective. So let me conclude, and then there's maybe a few moments for questions. To me, the story is that there is no substitute for focusing on achievement and skills and what people know in schools. The long-run economic future of each of your countries is, in simplest terms, dependent upon the skills of your population. And without a highly skilled population, our country will suffer. And what I tried to give you in the story about Brazil, you can do that estimate and that set of projections for other countries, is that the value of skills is huge, and it's much larger than I think most of you came into this room thinking. If you believe my numbers, or if you believe half of my numbers, you see that improving skills is worth a lot. There's one other thing I meant to say before, that talking to a professional group of mathematicians, the question comes up, you've looked at average skills of the population, but there are various ways to get average skills. One is that we can select out a few people that I, in other audiences, would call rocket scientists, but here I would call mathematicians. And we can develop the top mathematicians. Or we can look at the other end of the distribution and try to get skills for the whole population, a basic level of proficiency. And the question is, which is more important for growth? And the answer is that both are important. And both work together. Because having mathematicians with good ideas works best if you have a population that can implement those ideas, that has the skills to implement them. And so the value of both basic skills for the population and of high-level skills increases if you work at both ends of the distribution simultaneously and do not concentrate on just selecting who's going to be the next Fields Medal winner in your country. Thirdly, I would say that improvements are possible. We've seen that around the world. We've seen it in Brazil, we've seen it in Chile, we've seen it in Poland, we've seen it in Germany, and other places. And so it is possible. Improvements are difficult, and that's where I think all of you come in, is convincing your governments that it is worth the short-run political pain that is usually involved in making changes in educational systems to get the gains in the future, to reap the future economic benefits. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Hanushek, for a difficult, pertinent, challenging, encouraging lecture we do have about time for one or two questions, and I'm sure many of you really have some questions you'd love to ask, and you will definitely see Professor Hanushek at lunch. But is there someone who is brave enough to ask a question right now? Yes, in the third row. Please go to the microphone behind you and perhaps state your name and country.
My name is Muhammad Altom from Sudan. You started by saying that you are against education for all. Your talk suggests to me that you are in full support of quality education for all.
Absolutely. Thank you for making that connection. That is precisely what I'm in favor of. And the trade-off that often comes up in policy is, well, let's just blanket the country with crummy schools and then we'll make them better. Or let's start by trying to add on quality schools and expand from a base of quality. And I think that the latter policy is the one that is most effective. It's probably also the most politically difficult, because you're saying that you're going to selectively choose areas to get the quality schools and then move out, and that you're denying for some period of time schooling to others. But getting quality schools is the story.
Yes, I see one more question. Perhaps this will have to be the last one. Yes, please.
Thank you. First of all, great talk. I'm going to ask a question that I don't agree with, but I want to see what your opinion is. A lot of people in my case in Mexico, a lot of teachers, basic education teachers, claim that standardized test results shouldn't apply to some conditions, that they really don't measure success or skills. What do you say to those people?
The simple answer is that they're wrong. The more complicated answer is that there are bad tests that don't measure the range of skills that we want. But in Mexico and in large parts of the United States, if you have good tests, you want teachers to teach to the tests. As each of us does when we teach to our own tests. And that these skills really do pay off. Now, where it gets really tough when we talk about teachers is that people want to turn to using the performance of students to evaluate the teachers. And there you have to be careful, because you don't want to just take the graduation score of a student and attribute that to the grade 12 teacher, because there's a lot of preparation that goes into that. There's a lot of parental inputs, and in some areas where the parents don't add much, the kids come less well prepared. That's why in all of the evaluation systems, you basically want to look at the growth in achievement. What is being added, the added value of the teacher to the achievement, and hold people responsible for what they add to students. What we know at the other end is that in some of the schools where the parents have provided a lot of input and the schools in the past have been better, you don't want to reward a teacher just because the kids do well. You want to reward the teacher if, in fact, a high-performing student does even better. And so it's a matter of getting the metrics right. And then finally, it's clear that teachers in schools do a lot more than we measure on most of the simple tests of Spanish and math. And for that reason, you never want to rely entirely on student performance, but you want to have outside evaluators come in. The evidence we have from the United States, again, where we have this evidence in some detail, is that it is possible to evaluate the value added of teachers in a variety of dimensions, and so that you have outside evaluators come in and add to the evaluation of teachers. But you've put your finger on, the political issue of the world. Every nation in the world has strong teachers' unions, as Mexico does and other places, and they are quite happy with the way things are going now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, participants, and please join me again in expressing our thanks to Professor Hanushek.